Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all on behalf of ACFE Oman Chapter Board in our today's very interesting session. I, Hassan Ahmed, and we have joined by Mr. Haytham Al Raisi, Director Membership, ACFE Oman Chapter, and our distinguished guest speaker, Mr. Simon Merchant. Today's topic is the Updated Fraudsters Toolkit and how to neutralize it. Fraudsters run a business. They are nimble, agile, and creative, and their fraud toolkit never ceases to expand. From stolen credentials to synthetic identities, location, and IP spoofing or VPNs built of thousands of infected devices. They have hundreds of ways to circumvent traditional fraud prevention strategies. This was a brief introduction about today's topic, and Mr. Simon will shed light on it. Without any further delay, I will call Mr. Haytham Al Raisi to give formal welcome to our audience and speaker introduction. Over to you, Mr. Haytham.
Thank you so much, Hassan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're attending from. On behalf of ACFE chapter, I welcome you to this webinar. And I must say that this webinar, the title of this presentation grabbed my attention. And the title is Updated Fraudsters Toolkit and How to Neutralize It. Having heard of traditional fraud like the identity theft, synthetic fraud, and more advanced like the account takeover using different tools, including spoofing, I must say that these tools are being used by fraudsters, which we will hear today from our speaker on how can we utilize them proactively to be ahead of these fraudsters. So I'm sure everybody is excited, and I just want to remind all our members that we are available in the LinkedIn, and we are also running the next conference, the annual International Fraud Conference, which will be on 13th of November, and the registration is still going on, so you must have received it, where you can still register, and we're going to see you there. And without taking much of the time, let me introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker, Simon Merchant. He is the VP Fraud and Risk Strategy at GeoComply and a global leader in geolocation and compliance technology. He's a certified fraud examiner and a chartered administrator. He has extensive expertise in fraud prevention, detection, security and authentication in banking and telecom industries, as well as technology sector, with more than 13 years of experience in the field. Prior to his role at GeoComply, he held key fraud prevention positions at Montreal-based Laurentian Bank, Bell Canada, Quebec Order of Chartered Administrator. He comes all the way virtually from Montreal, Canada. So put your hands together to welcome our speaker, Mr. Simon. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haytham. Thank you, Mr. Hassan. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Quite a bit of an attendance, so it's good. Good evening, I guess, for most of you. It's still morning here in Montreal. Very happy to join you and get a bit of time to talk about what we see that fraudsters are now using. Like it was said before, I've worked in the banking industry for a while, worked in the telecom industry before moving in the technology sector, where I've helped develop different technologies. And part of my work is, staying connected to the anti-fraud community, go around the world, talk to fraud practitioners, and see what fraudsters are doing against them around the globe. And what I want to do today with you is look at some of how fraudsters are evolving their practice, because we have to look at this like a business, and more they're being very nimble in the way that they operate their businesses. I think as fraud practitioners, it's important for us to recognize that the fraudsters we had 15 years ago do not operate the same way today. And it must change the way we behave, the way we investigate, as well as the way we talk about fraud within our organizations, because convincing executives, convincing internal stakeholders of the risk of fraud and the importance to invest is part of our responsibilities. So, today, as you can see here, we'll look a bit at the fraud landscape. So I want to look at how things have evolved, how quickly some fraud types are growing, why it's not going away, how it's evolved in the way it's being operationalized. And I want to look at some of the tools that they're using, tools that, if you're looking around, you can find yourself and play around with. But I want to show you what fraudsters tell each other they should be using to hide from our anti-fraud technology. Then I want to look at the other side of the toolbox, what we can use as fraud practitioners to prevent specific types of attacks. Now, I'm not here today to tell you about one marvelous technology that will solve everything. I think any experienced fraud practitioner will know and tell you that there's no silver bullet. But I want us to have a good understanding of various things that are available out there, how they work, why they're useful, etc. And then I want to show you some, real life use cases. We can touch at some of the iGaming fraud problems that YouComply is solving. We work a lot with banks as well, but I want to give you maybe a brief oversight of some of the fraud issues that we see and fight. And then we'll take time for Q&A. There might be things I say today during the presentation that might not be clear. Please put your questions right away. Mr. Hassan will let me know if there's something that I should answer right away, but otherwise I'll make sure we have at least 10 minutes at the end to take your questions. I always tell people, I know we might not always be comfortable sharing all of our fraud issues, especially asking questions that are very specific. So if at any point you want to have a private discussion, you can also reach out on LinkedIn, you can shoot me an email, I'll put my address at the end. So if you prefer to do it that way, we can also connect offline. Without further ado, I want to start with this. For those of you that started in fraud years ago, this is what used to keep me awake at night. And quite literally, I started about 15 years ago in a very small bank in Montreal, working a night shift. And all night, what we were doing was monitoring debit card transactions to find and stop ATM attacks. So you can see, skimmers on the left here, those cloned debit card on the right. You're probably familiar with it. I'm sure you have the same issues or had them at some point, where you had those small groups of very artisanal, creative fraudsters, 2-3 people putting together the very first skimmers, even before the times of 3D printing, installing them themselves, waiting for a week to get the data out of it, create their own cards, and then start withdrawing themselves. That was prior to the introduction of the chip card, obviously, when a magnetic stripe was all you needed. I'm saying it kept me up at night because we were seeing groups of fraudsters clone cards for several weeks so they could reach thousands potentially of cards, and then they would put them in those little metal boxes with a lock on it, with a code, distribute it to a few collaborators, and then the code would be sent in the middle of the night to 20 people at the same time all over the city, and they would start withdrawing, $400 at a time, going through as many cards as quickly as they could, and we only had a few minutes to stop them, to find where the cards had been cloned, and to deactivate everything that had been through that specific area. Now, that was very, like I said, artisanal. It did not require a lot of people to be involved, and most likely, the folks that were copying the cards were also the ones producing them, and they were also the ones withdrawing the money. That was 15 years ago, and we saw a dramatic change in how fraudsters operated. I guess the biggest shift we started seeing is the shift in data breaches, which is heavily correlated with identity theft. So we started to see more and more, this is looking at 2020, but even going back in 2010, we started to see more and more data being stolen from big organizations. And that mostly was following our habits as consumers, where we became more and more comfortable sharing our data, opening accounts on different websites, making purchases online. When all of that became very normal, we started sharing our personal information with a lot of websites, one of which always had to be very vulnerable, some of which were collecting information they did not require without having proper data governance in place to protect us from eventual data breaches. And we started to see those data breaches more and more. Now, what we tend to say is that virtually now everybody has been compromised. It's not a question of if you will be a victim of identity theft, but very much when you will be a victim. And you can see here, right? We're looking at some quarters in 2022 with 250 million people being affected by data breaches in the world. So at that speed, you know, everybody's a victim. You have more than 120 million people being a victim every time. And that stops at the first quarter of 2024. I stopped it there because the second quarter of 2024 really shows something scary. You probably see it on your screen now. From April, making sure, to June, we're looking at 1 billion records that were compromised in a single quarter. It dwarfs everything that came before it. Now, this is very significant from a fraud standpoint and a fraud operation standpoint, because obviously it requires a very, very skilled profile to be able to perpetrate those data breaches. And that's one of the things we have started seeing in the 2010s. More and more, we saw people specialize their activity. So we had groups that were targeting specifically vulnerable organizations to extract data, selling it through a platform that was operated by a second group. And then a third group would just purchase the stolen information and monetize it. So more and more we saw very high levels of data breaches correlated with a very high growth in identity theft related crimes. Now the numbers you see here are for the US alone. It is unfortunately one of the only countries where we do have some good reliable data that is consistently measured. That said, in the US as well as in every other country on the planet, we have the same weakness to the data we have on identity theft, and it is that it relies exclusively on victims reporting that they were a victim. So the numbers you see here are probably 5 to 10 times lower than the reality. And we're looking here at quarters where there's almost 500,000 victims that were identified that took the time to call in. So we're probably looking at 5 million victims per quarter. That's an awful lot of identity theft cases. And that's not even accounting for every single time that a fraud team is able to stop the identity theft before it happens and leads to a loss, before us consumers are even aware that our identities were compromised. So we now have these groups specializing in using identity data. We now have these groups specializing in extracting data, working with brokers that are only there to facilitate transactions that were made much, much more easy with, first of all, Bitcoin, but in general, cryptocurrency, guaranteeing a certain level of anonymity. Now, more and more, we do see researchers being able to put together some tools that allow us to investigate properly cryptocurrency transactions. But for at least a decade, networks were able to kind of build themselves without necessitating the same level of confidence between each other. And it allows to create a very resilient chain of supply, where if you find one group of hackers and you decide to disrupt their operation, well, we're going to have other groups. And if you decide to take down, a Silk Road, one of the very first big dark web marketplaces that we heard of, well, there's going to be others that will be operated and will maintain their operations. And if you find one group of fraudsters using stolen data, it doesn't matter if you find them. Eventually, there's going to be another group operating. And all of these groups are very resilient in their operation, which makes it very difficult as a fraud practitioner to try and stop the problem that we're facing. Now, before I keep going, Hassan, do you want to confirm what you see on screen right now? Because I think there's probably a delay between what I'm presenting and what's being transmitted. But you should have 9 circles on the screen. Is that what the audience sees? Oh, you're not there anymore. Okay, let me keep. Yeah, sorry, tell me.
We can see 3 circles here.
You see 3. Oh, there should be 9. Okay, that is strange. Let me pause and then show again. I think there's just a very long delay before something moves. There you go. Now you should see 9. Okay, I'll try to keep an eye on this so it stays logical for everybody. Now the big question is, as these groups of fraudsters, refine their operation, who ultimately benefits from it? When it was a group of, very artisanal fraudsters in a garage, it was for their own benefit. But now that we see those very complex networks, we see more and more those transnational fraudulent activity be used to fund, terrorist activities and transnational crime rings that are committing much more heinous crimes with the proceedings of these fraud cases. This is a very interesting one if you want to look at it, and it really drove a lot of back in the days of AT&T's efforts into a very specific type of fraud called PBX hacking. PBX hacking, for those of you that didn't work in telco, is when a group of fraudsters will break into a phone system, let's say a company phone system, and during the middle of the night they will start calling a hotline, that costs $50 a minute, for example. Now, what the investigation from the FBI and AT&T led us to see is that the network that was committing these crimes was extremely complex. You had groups of hackers in the Philippines being hired to commit these attacks, but they were not taking all the money and all the profits. They were just being paid to execute. And other groups were holding the lines that were receiving the traffic, and other groups were sharing the profits and then funding attacks against, in that case, American interests. And when we start to look at these very complex networks, it really helps understand why we cannot just look at fraud as the one single issue that we see in front of us in a bank or in a government service. It is more than just the $1,000 that a certain person has lost. And very likely, it is funding more complex organizations that will be using the proceedings of these crimes for much greater things. Now, what we have seen since, I'm going to say 2020, very much, we have the same delay problem. Let me just reset this. There you go. What we have seen since the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is very much a transformation from these artists. We moved to those networks, which I was mentioning, but now we start to see state-sponsored organizations more and more active. When we look at schemes such as pig butchering, for example, they're very much operated with the backing of states such as China or Russia or North Korea, for example. But we also see fraud as a service emerge more and more as a very robust way for fraudsters to run their business. And when I say fraud as a service, I really mean fraudsters that do know how to target an organization, but because they want to lower the risk, they're not going to do everything. They're going to execute just a very small part, or they're going to explain how to perform an attack. They're going to sell their tips and tricks and mentoring and coaching services. And that makes it extremely difficult for fraud practitioners, because now we don't have these very predictable organizations. We start to see everybody having access to the how-to of different fraud attacks. If I look at the kind of information you can find, sorry, the delay again. But if I look at the type of information you can find online, let me just stop and share. You have, on forums now, you don't have to go too far, but on forums or on Telegram, you have access to stolen checks. You'll have access to stolen credit cards in the mail. You'll have access to accounts that can be taken over with registered payment instruments. That makes it extremely challenging, because as a Lambda user, I can go on Reddit and then find someone advertising their Telegram channel. I can download Telegram and just start chatting with fraudsters selling their services. What used to be relatively complex, where you needed a Tor browser, 10 years ago, and you needed to know where to find the forums, you needed to get cryptocurrency to make your payments. Now you can just go on an app that can be downloaded on any device from any legitimate app store and start having those conversations with fraudsters selling their services. That makes it very, very much the biggest challenge we should be aware of, because like I said, you're starting to look at the risks of dealing with opportunistic fraudsters, people that are not professionals, that are not willing to do this every day necessarily, but that will be hitting your organization once or twice and then disappear. It is easier than ever, and it is very, very comprehensive, the types of services you're going to get. You're going to have ebooks made available, right? The ebook you see on the left, or the image you see on the left, is an ebook called Bob's Refund Book. It is a 60-page guide, now I think maybe 100 pages with the new version, that you can find on Reddit with about 20 minutes of searches. And it explains to you step by step how to abuse return and refund policies for various online merchants, how to return merchandise and change the return label to make sure it gets lost in the mail so you can return empty boxes and still get your refund. It offers Telegram groups. It offers mentoring if you want to build your own return as a service business. It tells you how to do abusive chargebacks. That information is not hidden. Like I said, for those of you that are curious, you can send me an email or just get in touch and I can send you a PDF version of it so you can see what it's like. But you have those very, very robust courses now available to anybody. And you can see there as well like two examples of discussions taking place in Reddit, very openly asking, can I do a refund? Can I get a MacBook back on Amazon? What are the conditions? What are the thresholds? So now we see this socialization of fraud. We start to see it being discussed very openly. There was a survey in the early 2024 that raised a very concerning statistic that 42% of the Gen Z generation was committing some sort of fraud, most of which was friendly fraud and credit abuse, because they see it on TikTok or on Instagram. It looks like a life hack, something you can do. And because we know the financial situation of that generation might not be what it was for millennials or even Generation X before that, they have the financial pressure to act. They have an opportunity, and then they can rationalize it, thinking, well, it's just a life hack. It's just a trick against a big organization. And in the end, they might not think they're committing fraud, but they're becoming a huge volume of potential fraudulers that you have to deal with as fraud practitioners. And when you start looking at those ebooks, you're going to start seeing the tools that fraudsters use. It's not just about how to do the things, it's also about how to do the things safely and how to hide. Let me just share again. So they will recommend different encryption tools, different VPNs to use, different websites and email addresses and communication tools. And again, that makes it so that the person that is not necessarily tech savvy can start operating using very effective tools to try to circumvent any kind of protection you have in place. And when you start looking at what fraudsters are using very regularly, obviously VPN is a part of it. On screen you can see right now an example of a screen from a pig butchering computer. For those of you unfamiliar with pig butchering, the idea is to draw someone into a romance scam or some sort of communication scam like this, get them to build trust with the fraudster, and eventually get them to invest in some cryptocurrency platform that is obviously built and operated by fraudsters. One of the ways that they have to get to their victims is to do it on dating apps. So you can see here a bunch of dating apps that are targeted by fraudsters. The most important one is the VPN that they're using on the left, because they know that most organizations, yes.
Mrs. Simon, could you please, I think, yeah, now you're sharing the presentation. Perfect. It was not there.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so if I share the problem, I think is when I change screen, it stays on the old screen for a very long time, unfortunately. So I try to unshare and reshare, but please let me know if you still have problems. So yeah, this screen here is all the tools that they use, most of them being dating apps, but the most important one being a VPN, because most organizations are still focusing on an IP. They're still trying to find where a person is based on the IP address that they have. The problem with that is it's very easy to appear somewhere else, and we'll look at some examples of how easy it is to appear somewhere else. Some fraudsters, will sell you email addresses that have been verified that are not going to trigger any kind of validation. So if your monitoring is only on IPs, you'll be fooled by a VPN. If your monitoring is only on the email, you will be fooled by marketplaces that make emails available for just a couple cents. And again, I don't know what you see on your screen right now, but I have an example right here of email addresses costing 15 to 20 cents a piece, verified, aged, so that they can pass any kind of verifications that you might have in place. Other tools that fraudsters use, and this one we'll do a try. I'll try to show you a video and you can tell me if you see it. Hassan, do we still see right now the dating apps and VPN? Hassan, can you tell me what you see on the screen right now?
Yes, I can see the video.
Oh, you see the video. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So before playing the video, I want to draw your attention to some of the most advanced tools that now are being shared on the web. What you see right now, behind that blue square is a victim on a video call. On the top right, that man's face, that white man's face with the beard, is what the victim sees. So that person is being, brought into a romance scam. The fraudster is at the bottom right. That's the man that the victim is actually talking about and talking with. But there is a deepfake avatar superimposed in real time on that man's face so that the victim thinks that she's talking with the bearded guy. And if we press play, you will see at the bottom of the screen, you see that the face is moving, the head is moving left to right. It does give the impression that this is a real person. And these tools are not nearly as complex as they used to be, even 5 years ago, where you had to train your own deepfake models, where you had to know how to use deepfake properly. You can now go online, pay a few dollars, get the guide, the step-by-step to use it, and then as a fraudster, you can start operating using deepfakes. Furthermore, for those of you that want to use it, you can go on, OnlyFakes. The platform you see here is a screenshot from the website. You can see that I can pick my passport or the type of ID I need. I can put all of the information I want, put my face, and the result is baffling. If you click on next, the photo you see here of a passport is a deepfake. There's nothing real on that photo. The passport isn't real. The reflection, the data, the signature, the little plastic envelope, and the table, all of this is fake. All of this was generated artificially. So when you want to open an account and appear legitimate, and you want to use a stolen identity but your real photo because there's some sort of ID validation, maybe a selfie validation, well, you can generate these very, very easily. And like I said, with a very user-friendly interface where you just put the information, and if you need to do it in batch, they have an option for that, and it costs you only a few dollars, which you don't even have to pay with cryptocurrency anymore. You can do it with the prepaid credit card. So it makes it very, very easy for fraudsters to start using those very advanced tools that used to be extremely complex to use only a few years ago. That really brings the importance of having a holistic strategy. And I know that's kind of a word that we always use. That said, it is more important than ever. You need to have clear visibility of your account setup, because you want to make sure that fraudsters are not using stolen identities or synthetic identities. Depending on the countries where you operate, there are some countries where creating a synthetic identity is still not very difficult. You can try and open a prepaid phone account with a completely fictitious identity and IDs, and that will become the enabler to create a credit file that you can then feed some transactions into, and after a year, you appear as a legitimate individual while having nothing real attached to that profile. Stolen identities, like I said, they're so easy to steal, and the IDs are so easy to produce that we have to be conscious that any new account being opened can be opened with a stolen ID. That said, if you only focus on what's going to happen at account setup, immediately fraudsters will focus on the next vulnerability, which is, as we have seen in the past couple of years, account takeovers. And that means making sure that when someone logs in, you do not rely on very obsolete approaches. Credentials are easy to steal, just as easy to steal as entire identities. So we know that we need to step it up. We know that we need additional signals to determine if a password and login and password are being used from a specific area, a specific device, because we know that fraudsters are able to find those credentials. We know that they're able to intercept a one-time password sent via SMS. If you only rely on that, you're exposing your customers. They do have access to remote access tools, infected devices as well. So we need to understand that even if let's say I see a connection from this trusted device, a new specific connection might be a risky one, a suspicious one, a fraudulent one, even using the same device. Because if this has been infected and it's being sold, again, on a Telegram channel as an infected device for a known victim, you need to be able to see if you still have some level of session integrity, even if it seems to be the device from your known customers. Once the account's been taken over, and if you're only focusing on that, you're going to have to look at transactions themselves. And in some cases, you might let guests make a transaction without having much information on them. You might not even force them to have an account. So are we looking at suspicious behaviors, suspicious credit cards? But what type of behaviors are we looking at? Are we trying to tie together multiple transactions to determine if 10 purchases have something in common? Or do we always look at individual transactions? And finally, when it comes to chargebacks, keep in mind what I said before. More and more people are not professional fraudsters. They're opportunistic fraudsters. They're friendly fraudsters. There are people seeing a trick on Instagram or on TikTok and just following the steps. We've seen it last week in the US where people started depositing fake checks or empty envelopes to try and withdraw money because there was a glitch in Chase Bank systems. They didn't think they were committing fraud in a lot of cases. They were just following a video giving them a cue on how they could get, quick money. So we need to have a strategy that covers really every single part of the journey to make sure that we have tools in place that can help us determine, is that a real person? Or is that a real person's identity being used by the wrong human being? Is that my customer, or is that my customer's account being compromised? So on and so forth. Is this a legitimate chargeback that I'm receiving, or is that my customer trying to defraud me? And that brings us to a few different tools and pieces of tech that we can use against all of these technologies that was mentioned before. The first is, and that's very common, but it's absolutely necessary, but device fingerprinting. Making sure that if someone connects with that phone and comes back with that phone, I can identify that. And making sure that if I give my phone to someone else and they connect with a different account, I can still see that these two accounts are tied to the same device. The reason why you want to do that is to introduce as much friction for the fraudsters as you can. If they have to buy multiple phones and multiple devices to attack your organization, they might decide to move to an easier target. So you should always have those first barriers. The second one is locating where that device is as it's making a transaction. Because if I buy 20 burner phones to make 20 accounts, but they're all located in the same apartment, I suddenly have additional indications that there might be something going on there, that this might be either a network of fraudsters or a very well-organized fraudsters building himself a little farm of different devices to try and pass under the radar, trying to circumvent any kind of device fingerprinting. And we'll talk a bit about these two features a little later. Once you have that device fingerprinting, that geolocation, then you can start building some AI-driven models. Because obviously, if you see multiple transactions from multiple unknown devices, but in the same house, in the same neighborhood, with a very specific density and how they operate and where they operate from, you can start building your own models as to what's supposed to be a normal behavior, geographically speaking, for a specific device, and what's an abnormal behavior. And once you do that, you can also do it, typically speaking, with consortium data. Obviously, a bank might not have visibility across an entire market, but if the vendor that you're working with is able to geolocate transactions across 20 different banks all over the globe, then all of a sudden you're starting to leverage the data these other banks have. One great example that that comes from the business I'm currently with, in the iGaming world, there's very few players. You have some 3 or 4 very, very big players in the United States. Being able to see the same device placing a bet or opening an account across 4 different vendors or 4 different platforms can be used by all of these platforms, where we can say, you know what, this device for you might not appear to be suspicious, but we've seen them with 2 different banks and 4 different gambling platform and 2 social media, all with different credentials in the past 24 hours. And all of a sudden, what seemed to be innocuous to one specific business becomes data from all the businesses that they can leverage and start making more sense of what's happening on that device. At the bottom, you can see device integrity. That's extremely important. Like I said, my phone can be identified as my device, can be tied to me. That's not a problem, it's perfect. But if that phone has been compromised, you need to be able to say, hey, yes, it is the right device, it is Simon's phone, but there's something fishy going on with it. There might be someone else accessing his bank account through his phone. Same goes for session integrity, where we do have a lot of scams where elderly people are being manipulated. They're sharing their screen. You need to be able to know if someone's sharing their screen as they're logging into their bank account. And finally, I did mention that IPs were not very reliable when it comes to locating where someone is because they can hide. But knowing if an IP is coming out of a VPN or out of a Tor node is critical. You need to be able to tell if someone's trying to hide in a nefarious network, to hide where they're actually working from. And just to show you, a few of the techniques that I'm talking about, what it really means, right? When you're looking at IP addresses, when it comes to locating someone, you're going to be looking at accuracy of about 50 to 1,000 kilometers. It's very inaccurate. The green circle here is where I live. This is where I'm actually physically located, even as I'm talking to you. But if I use my IP to locate me, I will appear to be in that little red circle at the bottom, which is a few kilometers away from my home. If I was a fraud expert investigating this, what does that tell me? It tells me nothing valuable about where I'm connecting from. I don't seem to be in the right house, not even in the right neighborhood. So I cannot look at that transaction and think that this is the real individual. I cannot really know if it's a fraudster either because, obviously there's such a huge radius of operation. But furthermore, with just a few clicks and an off-the-shelf VPN, I will appear to be in the middle of Sao Paulo. This was like literally 30 seconds from what I showed you before, and that becomes extremely problematic because if you're basing your detection on where exactly a person is, well, they're going to be easily fooled. That's why we tend to talk about advanced geolocation, which would include GSM triangulation as a first step, which basically is using all of the antennas around the device and triangulating exactly that device position. You can see now you're moving from 50 kilometers down to 500 meters to 2 kilometers. And you layer it. You layer it with Wi-Fi triangulation. And that's not necessarily using the Wi-Fi network that you're connected to, but all the Wi-Fi networks that you see, that your device sees. Even that is sufficient to give very, very accurate, down to 20 meters, accurate an accurate idea of where a person is. And obviously in very high regulation environments where you can mandate the GPS permission to be given, you can go as precise as 1 meter. That means that if someone is using a VPN, which you see on the screen is a real investigation, for example, the person appears, you can see the red thing here, based on their IP, to be in the United States, operating from Miami, Florida. That's what you would see if you're only basing your detection on the IP address being used. The reality, when we look at the device and we see the Wi-Fi networks that this device sees, we can determine that this person is actually in Colombia, in the Cali suburbs. You can see the distance here between where the person tries to be in Miami all the way down to Colombia, where they're actually operating from. And if you have a bit more information on the neighborhood, you'll know that it's probably a neighborhood heavily controlled by the FARC, which is a terrorist group, paramilitary operating from the country. So very, very powerful when you are able to see behind the IP address, behind a VPN. And again, this particular device did not have to be connected to Wi-Fi. It just needed Wi-Fi turned on, and all the data could be collected and triangulated to give that more accurate image during the investigation. Let me just continue here. We do say advanced geolocation, not just because of its accuracy, but because once you start locating people, you need to at every time be able to locate if that person's going to spoof where they are. One great example is this one. You can get an app that allows you to appear somewhere else. Some people will typically use that because they want to go on a dating app in another city, for example, or they're playing Pokemon Go. They want to appear in a different city to hunt some Pokemons. Very innocuous uses. In reality, fraudsters will try to use it to appear in a different city as they operate. But even further, you can see on the right that they might be using hardware. They might connect something in the device to spoof their location. This is the kind of material you can purchase on eBay for a few dollars, and you can even get to some very complex systems. Like this costs about $3,000. Very advanced, complex location spoofing capabilities that fraudsters are using, knowing full well that they need to circumvent any kind of IP-based geolocation security systems or anti-fraud systems. So some very advanced fraudsters groups will be using this. We need to know that this is available out there. We need to know that these complex systems are available, because if we ignore them, we ignore the possibility that fraudsters will be operating from restricted jurisdictions or operating from multiple accounts in the same location, et cetera, et cetera. That's why we talk about advanced geolocation. Whatever tools you use, it's not just about collecting the location data. It's about making sure that there's a certain level of integrity to the data you're receiving, so that your fraud investigators looking at that pin on the map knows that it's something reliable. And obviously, once you start having that, you can start building those network graphs, right? You've probably seen this in the past, where you have a person linked to a device, linked to an address. The new element you have is you can now start creating implicit links. When you see 2 or 3 devices, maybe each tied to 3 accounts, but in close proximity to one another for an extended period of time, all of a sudden you can start drawing links between networks that would normally be completely separate. It creates much more complex networks, but it also allows you to build those cases more reliably for law enforcement. And I'll show you what it really means. I have a few cases where you actually see how many phones and accounts we're able to tie together. And in the interest of time, because we had a few technical issues here, just want to show you, to give you an idea, that this data is from Washington, D.C., but it's just to show you how many transactions trying to appear in Washington are actually coming from locations all over the world. I didn't have data for Oman, unfortunately, but it gives you an idea of it's coming from everywhere. It's fraudsters from South America, from Central America, obviously from Nigeria, from Ivory Coast, but also from all over Europe, even from Canada, trying to appear as they're in DC. But we see this all over the world. We see it everywhere. And I'm sure any organization in Oman, if we were connected into it, we would be able to show you the same kind of spoofing activity. It is very eye-opening for a lot of organizations when they start seeing this appear during a pilot. Now, I want to have time to cover specifically this iGaming cases, but they're very close to what you'd see in banking. What I want to show you is what we see when we start looking at those real-life use cases. Like this one, for example. Fraud activity, what does it mean when you're investigating in a specific city? Typically when you're doing geolocation, you're obviously geolocating millions of transactions, and you start seeing those heat maps across the country or across a specific region, allowing you to drill down and try to find where the fraudsters are. So if we look at the state level, you have that heat map in the city of Washington, D.C., but you can zoom. You can start seeing, okay, there are a few regions here and there where there is a bit more fraud activity, and you can zoom in and you start to see, okay, there's a lot of fraud activity in a Russian Orthodox church, as well as in that particular community center and right here at the end of that street. And then you can keep going. You can see that, okay, there is something going on in that particular building. And you can keep going and start seeing, okay, well, in that building, it is literally right in the front here that we have a lot of fraud activity. So it could either be that they're in the front yard or in the lobby, or maybe there's an apartment right here. So you can imagine as a fraud investigator what it means for you when you start looking at an entire country, an entire city, and you can start looking at street level crimes, right? You can go from a region all the way to a room or to a floor. That allows you to bring cases to law enforcement very effectively. This one's a great example, 370 transactions, proxy betting, 4,000 transactions, but 371 accounts, targeting 4 different operators. So operators are like a FanDuel or a DraftKings. But when you look at the map, you can see that they're operating from a house. They're operating from a room at the back of the house. So if you say, okay, I have 370 victims, decide to call, law enforcement and tell them, this is what I see. If you get a mandate and you get in the house, just go in the back and you will find something. And obviously, once police managed to get into this house, they found dozens of phones, dozens of computers. They found stacks and stacks and stacks of stolen identities, all the information they needed to convict that particular criminal. They could pinpoint in which room it would be found. This is extremely important because it allows you to go beyond just looking at one fraud case and one loss for your organization to actually having a more meaningful impact, to having that very strong collaboration that allows you to say, hey, I want to find that person. They might be using deep fakes. They might be trying to hide behind a VPN. They might be using stolen synthetic identities, tons of burner phones. But in the end, it's that particular house in which there's going to be 1, 2, or 3 individuals, no more, and then you can arrest them. Or you can geofence, around it and prevent transactions from happening. You can start monitoring what's happening at the house level, like in this particular case where you're looking at 28,000 transactions, 500 victims. You just have to draw a line around it, and you can see everything that's ever happened in that particular area, particular backyard, particular house. That also really helps your investigation, and you can decide to say, you know what? During my investigation, I want to make sure that no more accounts will be successfully opened by these fraudsters. So let's just prevent any account from being opened in that particular house. And that's something that, that allows you to do. So you can use it for investigation. You can also use it in real time. And, that brings us to the end. I did want to keep a 10-minute to talk and take your questions. I will make this presentation available. Not as is, I have to edit a few things, but I'll share it with Mr. Hassan so he can share with you all. If you do have questions you're not willing to ask publicly here, you can reach out. So my email is here. You can find me on LinkedIn. But otherwise, very happy to take any questions you might have. We have about 10 minutes to cover them.
Mr. Haytham, do you see any questions there?
We do not.
I cannot see a question, but I would like to go forward and ask you some questions. I understand that what makes you awake, by now I understand what makes you awake, but I think what makes us awake here in Oman specifically are account takeover and impersonation related fraud.
Yep.
And I just wanted to maybe share something that you mentioned about controlling an account takeover using VPN. The mobile banking are accessible using VPN. We usually here in the Middle East, specifically Oman, we disable the feature of VPNs. So they are not allowed. I wanted to know, I have a question about link analysis. How far would you be able to go when you use link analysis? How in depth can you go?
You can go very far. So I've shown, using link analysis with device proximity, you can layer that network on the locations. If you really want to push it one level further, you can link it with biometrics information. So I used to work in voice biometrics, for example. So if these individuals are calling you, you can link individuals with their locations, with the voice of the fraudster, and that voice with every other call that was ever made, and very often with the real account that this person has, because people still need a bank account. So you can go very, very far with this. I'd say if you have very strong and reliable device fingerprinting, your account information, the location of each transaction, you probably have something that's already 85% there, 90%. The rest is going to be your implicit links, where you want to have, like I said, let's say 3 devices that might seemingly be unrelated, but they're all operating from the same house. Then you create your links. That allows you to have a more complex network. And if you have any kind of biometric information, then you have the human being. It's a case you can bring to justice and put them behind bars.
Yeah. My other question would be, I'm sure you just mentioned about the use of AI, and especially in geolocation, especially fraud monitoring. what the challenges? What are the challenges that you see that if we use AI for geolocation, especially geolocation monitoring?
Your biggest challenge will be the size of the data you have. Because here's one thing, for example, you might want to look at the proportion of fraud transactions or suspicious transactions in a specific area. Your AI model will try to change the radius so that, okay, maybe for that particular city or that particular street, you want to have a smaller radius because it's more dense, with population. In other areas, you might want to expand it. But unless you are a huge bank and you have tens of millions of transactions every month, it'll be very difficult to know what is normal everywhere in a specific country. So it's very challenging to get those very big models to get to a certain level of accuracy, unless you're a big organization. That's why we tend to say for these big investigations, big models, try to rely on one level above, try to go consortium. So you have all the banks factored in and someone tells you this is suspicious because I know that at this level with everything I see across the country, it is. You might not believe that, you might not see so much activity to have a good informed model. So I think that's the biggest challenge. It's the size of the data and the quality of the data. Because obviously if you build a model but you don't have anti-spoofing in place, you're going to be building a model where people appear everywhere, but you don't really trust that they're really there. So I'd say that's probably the second biggest challenge, the quality and integrity of the data you're using in your model.
Yeah, I guess I have another question for you. This is in terms of implementing the geolocation or integrating a geolocation data into your transaction monitoring. Is there any specific scope or information? Because if we look for a company or a provider who provides a range of geolocation, let's say we want to know the range of that IP addresses in a specific country. Is there anything that specifies that when I choose a vendor or a service provider, what should I look for?
It's very difficult. So if you only look at IP, you will want to have two things, right? Which databases do they leverage, and how many databases, which they might decide not to disclose to you, but also what do they do internally? How many people do they have working, for example, on nefarious VPN networks, nefarious bot networks? Because one thing is having the IP that says, okay, this is in Oman, this is in United States, but do we have information on, okay, this is a VPN IP, this is a nefarious one, commercial one, this is a data center. So that's the one thing if you only look at IP. If you look at more advanced geolocation where it's going to be embedded in the SDK of your application or on the browser, then you want to look at, okay, how many million transactions did you process to show me that you can have some very powerful models, and how quickly can you deploy? Because a lot of players will tell you that they can do it, but then they'll take a year to train a model, right? And they essentially don't have anything out of the box, and you become the guinea pig. It's very important sometimes to say, hey, like I want to know how many big customers you have. I want to know when I'm going to see value with this. And if it takes a year, maybe start looking at other vendors. If the deployment and the integration appears to be very complex, geolocation is not supposed to be complex. Yeah, I've seen deployments go in 2 days. If it is complex, it's because they're probably not very comfortable with their tech, or they don't understand your business well. So when you go to RFPs, make sure you're asking all the questions. Make sure you see a track record of that vendor. Make sure you understand how many fraud experts they have, because that's another thing, right? You have a lot of technology providers. They just tell you, here's the tech and figure it out. I want to work with someone that knows the types of fraud that this is supposed to detect, that can help me understand how to make the best of it. That's also a good question to ask when you look for vendors.
Yeah, I agree. I think the proof of concept could work more, and a reference check would definitely help. I don't have any questions. Over to you, Hassan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Haitham and Mr. Simon, for a wonderful presentation. this time to wrap up our session due to time constraint. This is a formal vote of thanks time now. I would like to thank His Majesty Sultan Haytham bin Tariq for providing us opportunity to grow in Oman. I would like to thank our BIFS College for sponsoring our chapter, ACFE Oman chapter. I would like to thank our our speaker of today's session, Mr. Simon Merchant, for a wonderful presentation. Especially, I like the real world examples which you have shown us. I hope there are a lot of takeaways from your session today, and we would love to see you again. I would like to thank all the board members, Mr. Khalil, our president, Mr. Maad al-Balushi, our pastor, Mr. Jos Chaku, and Mr. Haytham al-Raisi, Mr. Salim al-Shafri, Ms. Fathi al-Maskari, Mr. Prabhu, Mr. Prashant, and all the subcommittee members for organizing the events. And last but not the least, all the member of our chapter, ACFE Oman chapter, because they are the reason for our existence. Dear members, please see our social media accounts for our upcoming sessions, and we have shared save the date for the upcoming conference on 13th November 2024, which is Fraud Awareness Week as well. And thank you so much. Before the wrapping up the session, Mr. Simon, would you like to say something?
I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to join today. And like, if there's anything, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Simon. Have a good day, everyone. Have a good night as well. See you, Masla.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon.
Bye.